the next work in the session is being presented by Genevieve Smith and Julia Nee. This is Advancing Social Justice Through Linguistic Justice, Strategies for Building Equity-Fluent NLP Technologies. So take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Genevieve Smith, and I'm here with my colleague, Julia Nee. We're presenting on our paper, Advancing Social Justice Through Linguistic Justice, Strategies for Building Equity-Fluent Natural Language Processing Technology, a paper we wrote with our colleagues, Alicia Shears and Ishita Ursagi. We respectfully acknowledge that this work has been developed at UC Berkeley, which sits on unceded Ohlone land. And as a brief content warning, we have a short discussion of gender-based violence. So language and social reality are mutually reinforcing. And as a result, natural language processing, NLP, presents a unique opportunity to shift social reality at scale, advancing social justice by promoting linguistic justice. However, many insights from the social sciences and other fields remain underutilized to date in the field of NLP. So to begin to bring insights from the social sciences into NLP development, today we'll begin by defining linguistic justice and illustrating the linkages between language and power. And then we present our framework for centering inclusion and social justice in NLP design at 4 overlapping layers of linguistic structure. The goal is to provide a foundation for adopting equity-centered principles in the creation of NLP tools that don't simply mitigate social biases, but actively advance inclusion and social justice through language. We'll end with a case study of how our framework was used by a leading Silicon Valley tech firm before wrapping up with some key takeaways. Over to my colleague, Julia.
Thanks, Genevieve. So let me first define what we mean by linguistic justice. We define linguistic justice to be achieved when all people have equitable access to social, political, and economic life through any mother language. As more and more services are being administered via NLP, linguistic justice then entails equitable access to NLP tools. It also requires equitable performance by those tools for speakers of different language varieties. If, for example, an NLP tool can accurately transcribe the speech of white but not Black speakers, this can result in inequitable access. Finally, linguistic justice requires the equal valuation of all language varieties. If some varieties are considered better than others, despite the fact that this is untrue and all languages are equally well suited to communication, speakers of those varieties may also come to be considered better than speakers of other varieties. In order to promote equitable treatment of people, we must also promote equitable treatment of their languages. In order to understand how we might achieve linguistic justice, there are a few key concepts about how language works within society that are important for us to understand. As Genevieve mentioned, language and reality are mutually reinforcing. As humans, we create and use language that reflects our own realities, experiences, and worldviews, but language can also subtly influence how we feel, think, and act. If we use language with discriminatory categories or descriptions, we may be encouraged to think in those same discriminatory terms. For example, whether we or an NLP tool use the term illegal alien or undocumented worker has been shown to impact how the audience feels about the real people that those terms describe. Ensuring that words and phrases that promote equity are output by NLP tools can have a positive impact on social justice. Secondly, power and language are intertwined. People in power inform what words and phrases are legitimized and included in dominant narratives, and which then in turn are considered standard. For example, if NLP tools are trained on government documents that use terms like illegal alien, this term and the worldview it represents may become normalized. At a higher level, the language varieties themselves used by people in power can come to have more prestige. In the US, Standard American English, also called White Mainstream English, has been assigned value, while equally expressive and valid varieties like African American English have been devalued. Third, language can serve as a gatekeeper. Humans are able to infer massive amounts of social information from language. For example, when you pick up the phone and hear someone say hello, with this one word, you are likely already beginning to form an image of who that person is, their gender, race, age, etc. As more and more essential services are distributed with the help of NLP tools like virtual assistants and chatbots, it's important to ensure NLP tools are not using language to infer social categories and discriminate. So with these key concepts in mind, we'd like to present our framework for considering how linguistic justice, and as a result, social justice, might be promoted within NLP. The framework addresses concerns at each of 4 overlapping levels of linguistic structure, from the smallest level of words and phrases to the largest level, power inequities. Each layer builds upon the next. So now we'd like to explore each of these 4 levels. Layer 1 is concerned with words and the associated meanings that they bring. Even if a word is not intended to cause harm, associations it may have picked up over time can be harmful to people. We can work to develop NLP-powered tools that flag potentially harmful terms. For example, AcroLinks and AllyBot are 2 tools that can be used to flag potentially harmful tools and suggest alternatives. Within NLP, addressing harmful terms is important both in the code itself and in datasets. There are options to replace harmful coding terms, such as primary, secondary, instead of master slave. Harmful terms in datasets, whether in data labels or in language data itself, may be learned and reproduced by NLP tools. Using filters to flag and remove hate speech and toxic language from datasets can help. However, deciding whether a term may be harmful is nuanced and context dependent. For example, some terms are considered harmful slurs by many, but may be reclaimed by some for empowerment. In addition, it's important to provide space for people to provide their own labels for their identities. At layer 2, how words are organized into phrases and sentences can also impact equity. For example, use of passive language can downplay the role of the people who carried out actions and redirect focus on the person affected. This is common with respect to reporting on sexual abuse. Passive voice, as in the woman was attacked, puts the focus on the victim. This can subtly suggest that the solution to the problem rests on the victim. The use of verb tenses can also result in misleading information. For example, describing ongoing processes like discrimination as occurring in the past can downplay the continued presence of these forces. Consider how NLP tools can be built to help reflect on organization of words and phrases for equity and inclusion, such as for journalists. Also consider how NLP datasets can be curated in ways that portray agency and resilience rather than relying on deficit-based narratives.
At layer 3, we look at patterns in language use and how they can amplify stereotypes and biases. When 2 things are repeatedly juxtaposed over time, and by association, one comes to indicate the other, this is called indexicality. For example, repeatedly using gendered terms like chairman that juxtaposes a position with men reinforce that men typically fill that role and index that role with men. Machines can pick up on subtle associations between certain words and groups. Even if an NLP system does not explicitly take sensitive characteristics like race or gender into account, they can still pick up on indexes from the data. This can result in the machine inadvertently making associations, predictions, and decisions that result in discrimination against members of marginalized groups and/or amplification of social norms and stereotypes that are limiting. Take GPT-3, a large language model created by OpenAI. When prompted with 2 Muslims walked into a blank, it returns descriptions of violence. Other NLP tools are being developed to highlight potential linguistic biases in our patterns of language use. Tools like Textio flag gendered language and job descriptions and can help highlight potential biases and stereotypes. In building NLP tools, researchers often seek to include ever greater amounts of data under the assumption that more data makes the system more accurate. But if the data contains patterns reflecting limiting gender or racial norms, stereotypes, and harmful biases, more data will lead to the same issues and discrimination. So it's very important to consider how data is curated. In level 4, let's explore power inequities. Not all groups have equal access to power and the languages associated with power. For example, many language models draw data from the internet, but internet access and use varies demographically. Some sites from which data is commonly scraped for large language models, like Reddit, Wikipedia, Twitter, etc., have particularly strong skews and overrepresentation of white men's voices. Although language datasets often include dozens of languages, they tend to feature texts of standard monolingual language varieties. While NLP tools are often meant to serve a wide public, if trained only on a subset of language data with an overrepresentation of one variety, there'll be inequitable performance of an NLP tool and inequitable outcomes for individuals. For example, automated speech recognition has shown higher error rates for Black speakers than white speakers. Increasing language diversity in NLP development can help to solve misclassification issues through which tools often fail to identify speakers' language variety if it differs from the standard. Further, they'll contribute to greater social equity by pushing back against standard language ideologies that place the burden on marginalized speakers to learn and use the standard. At the same time, data collected from marginalized speakers and communities must be gathered in a way that respects privacy and choice. Not all communities have the same definitions of intellectual property, and some language data may contain sensitive information that must be protected. To better serve those whose data may be used by NLP, learn about community standards for language and data use before diving into a project. There's immense opportunity to approach projects from a collaborative framework through which members of language groups are fully included in the process of determining whether or how their data is collected, what's done with it, and who maintains ownership, such as by using participatory research methods. NLP developers should recognize what data any given system was trained on, the sources of the data, and how those texts may reflect limiting stereotypes and contain biases or prioritize certain voices. Developers can document this information using tools like data statements for NLP and be transparent about the limitations of the tools built with the given data set.
A second issue at this fourth layer is that our perceptions of language, what ways of speaking we consider good or bad, professional or unprofessional, are subjective and reflect power inequities. If NLP tools learn from historical data about whose speech is professional or what success sounds like, for example, they may reproduce biases that promote white-sounding speech and penalize speakers of other backgrounds. Similarly, data labelers may introduce their own biases into the labels they assign to data. If the labelers do not speak a language variety fluently, they may mislabel it, either by mistranscribing what was said or by labeling a clip as unintelligible. Subjective labels, such as deciding whether speech is offensive or not, can also reflect stereotypes. For example, tweets in African American English are often considered more hateful or offensive than tweets written in standard American English, as we heard earlier. NLP developers can ensure data labelers speak or sign the specific language varieties that they're labeling and that they're trained to counteract biases. Creating NLP tools that work effectively for a diverse set of language varieties can contribute those language varieties gaining prestige as ways of communicating. This in turn may help to elevate the status of speakers of those languages and work to create greater linguistic justice overall.
As part of our framework, we developed key questions to ask at each level. And we collaborated with the leading Silicon Valley tech firm to pilot the framework and found that it was useful across the 4 levels. At the level of words and phrases, the firm is exploring automated tools that flag potentially harmful terms and offer alternatives. We worked with the firm on this and how to incorporate context-specific insight. In layer 2, the firm expressed commitment towards greater documentation and transparency in data sets to work towards accurate, abundance-based representations of marginalized groups. There's also potential to expand the abilities of the automated tools to consider organization of words and phrases like passive language. Within layer 3, the firm has collaborated with interdisciplinary experts, including our team and community leaders, to develop inclusive language practices that can be built into the tool for flagging harmful content. While addressing issues at the 4th layer, power inequalities, was the most difficult, we were able to have productive conversations around what data should be used in NLP development and who's qualified to label language data. Addressing concerns about consent for language data use, privacy, ownership, and transparency is a priority for the firm. Finally, the firm has encouraged data labeling partners to better ameliorate discriminatory outcomes of linguistic bias. With one such group, we piloted a lesson plan for data labelers related to addressing bias in data labeling, and the group has expressed interest in further piloting it in their internal training efforts. We should ask ourselves whose language data is included in data sets and whose language data is prioritized. If privileged language varieties continue to be the first varieties included in NLP development, they will continue to hold their position as gatekeepers. Instead, developing tools that serve a wider range of language users may help to decenter the hegemonic power of standard language varieties and lead to greater empowerment for marginalized language users. At the same time, we recognize a tension between the desire to include a greater diversity of language varieties within NLP and the need to respect the decisions of language users who may not want their language data to be used for NLP. While creating NLP systems that encompass a greater diversity of languages has the potential to shift power and prestige, we must not use this as an excuse to engage in harmful practices, like extracting data from language communities, violating community standards for intellectual property rights, building tools that work against community needs, or violating individual and community privacy. Instead, we should pursue linguistic equity and justice by building NLP tools collaboratively, involving members of language communities as partners throughout the process, and with a willingness to shift or abandon a project that does not fit community needs. In addition, we must strive to create workplaces and environments where NLP development is equitably led by members of different backgrounds and whose ideas and contributions are listened to. Creating a more inclusive environment will require that those in power not only allow for marginalized voices to be heard, but also uplift and amplify those voices into positions of power and decision-making. Finally, we must remember that language and reality are mutually reinforcing. We must work to eliminate the factors that make it difficult for marginalized groups to equitably participate within our teams, communities, organizations, and society. We'd like to leave you with a worksheet that provides our key questions to ask at each level of the 4 layers to guide you in NLP tool development. Thank you.